Hey guys, what we're going to do for part of our lesson today is we're going to kind of talk about the end of the Black Plague era, or kind of the culmination of this time period. So what you see at the top of the screen here is obviously information that we've already had in our notebook for quite a while. So if you remember, we started with kind of why it has two different names or how they're interchangeable. We talked about how it existed before the year 1347, and it definitely existed after because it still exists to this day. But this 47 to about 51 or 53 time period is kind of the real height of the bubonic plague. We've talked before again about how the effects are quite numerous, to be honest. So they had a bunch of cold winters, they had some rainy summers on top of that, and it led to a lot of bad crops. So with those bad crops, we had mentioned that people started to kind of stock their food up or keep their food in a barn or in crates such as these, and that's where a lot of these problems come from. So you have the bacteria, that Yersinia pestis, that is in the fleas and then can be, directly transmitted to people, or it can kind of go through that process that we've discussed before. And we've also looked at the numbers of dead. And you guys obviously have more pie charts and bar graphs and all that. But essentially, it's one out of every two, or at minimum, one out of every three Europeans dead from this disease over the course of about 5 to 6 years. Okay, so what we haven't talked about before at all is this information at the bottom. So, what we're going to do today, not only with your notebook, but obviously kind of having a conversation here at the same time, we're going to go through the effects, like kind of the results of what was going on at the time, aside from obviously a bunch of people dying from it. And then what I have at the very bottom is what's considered to be the end, and I have it in quotes for a pretty specific reason, but the end of the plague. Okay, so what we can do is obviously you guys in with your notebooks can put this information as you see it onto a page. But of course, we're going to take a little bit to flesh out each of these just a little bit. So there might be a little bit more that you want to add to it, or you might want to make a little note to it, or kind of just a side bullet point. But we'll just kind of go through the list here, and then we'll talk about the effects and technically the end. Okay. So, obviously, the biggest effect of the plague was the number of people that died. So, that doesn't even make the list because I think it just kind of goes without saying. Okay. But one of the big things here was the very first bullet point, and we've said how religion had a major impact over the course of the Middle Ages. But I also said that as the Middle Ages progresses, people become less and less concerned. Okay, so not that they give up on religion, but they really want to question how important is somebody like the Pope or a bishop or paying money to my church if everybody around me is dying. So, one of the very first bullet points here, as you can see, is that people thought God was punishing them. So, there was a lot of people at the very beginning of this plague and during the course of it that thought there's not going to be a plague cure, there's not going to be a plague vaccine. This is pretty much God telling us that what we're doing is somehow wrong. So they felt that God was punishing them for whatever reasons, and not necessarily that the only people that were dying of it were the biggest sinners, so to speak. That wasn't the thought. But basically, that overall God must be angry about something, so therefore he's kind of cursed us with this plague. So there was a lot of people who had kind of that religious thought of it. One of the issues that we didn't talk about a whole lot, but they did get into it really quick in the Brain Pop video the other day, was how some people blamed outsiders or foreigners for bringing the plague in the first place. So this is kind of an angle here that wasn't mentioned, but there's two groups: Jews, so Jewish people, and gypsies, which I'll get to in here in a second, were blamed and were driven out. Okay, so here's another example. If you remember the Brain Pop video, they said that a lot of times, for whatever reasons, people thought that foreigners were somehow to blame for bringing this thing in, and they would, be violent towards them or drive them out. And there's two specific groups here. But what's interesting about these groups is it really doesn't have anything to do with the fact that they were foreign, but it has to deal with the fact that they, as collective groups, were not getting the plague as much as your average Europeans. And we're going to explain why here in a second. But first of all, Jews obviously represents Jewish people. But gypsies is not specifically a country or group we have talked about a whole lot. So gypsies are actually people that come from the modern day country of Romania, but what they're known for is being nomadic or moving around quite a lot. And there's a lot of different reasons, like the type of work that they do, and some of their beliefs, but they move around a lot from country to country or city to city. So a lot of people did not trust them. Okay. But what's interesting about these two groups is because of their cultures and because of their religions, they were actually a lot more hygienic or they were a lot more clean than the average European at the time, believe it or not. So Jewish people and gypsies, because of their beliefs, bathed more and washed their hands more and just were generally more clean. And as we've already seen before, being more hygienic and being more cleanly is going to lead to less of a spread of disease. But from an outsider's perspective, they just thought that there was something fishy going on, right? They felt that the Jews had cursed everybody, or the gypsies kind of had some kind of magic spell. Because how in the world are they not getting this? Okay, well, again, Jews and gypsies are more hygienic naturally, and they're actually more isolated. They are very to themselves. So if you think about it, if groups are kind of more to themselves and they don't really interact with a whole lot of people, they're less likely to get it. So that was just kind of a funky effect of the plague overall. The third one here is actually pretty quick because it's so obvious. As other countries around Europe hear about the Black Plague and the effects, they're really not going to want to have as much to do with trade for several years at least, right? So, right here it says that trade declined sharply because obviously people from the surrounding areas knew that the plague was going on at that time. So, they really had no interest in going over there themselves or getting goods shipped from there. And this is mentioned in the brain pop, and we've talked about it real quick. But Europe is not really going to have a whole lot in which to trade because they don't even have a whole lot of people to work the fields or produce the goods. They're all just trying to survive this deadly disease. So that is why trade pretty much goes down for quite a while. And another big effect that was mentioned the other day in the Brain Pop video was the fact that the hierarchy or that kind of social class system that had existed during the majority of the Middle Ages. So, having your upper class and your kind of middle and lower, this was pretty much going to break down, as you saw in the brain pop the other day, because really people figure, why is everyone else so important? And if I'm a peasant, why am I less important? Everybody's out here trying to survive the Black Plague. Many people of all different class levels are dying from it. So there really is no solution, and there definitely is no reason for me to be kind of subservient to a king or to care more what a pope thinks than trying to take care of my own family. So this whole social class system of having like kings and queens and nobles and all that, and then you have everybody else being the peasant or the commoner class, that's going to break down really fast. And there's other factors that led to that, of course, like the failure of the crusades and the arguments between different kings and pope, the different popes of the time. So there's all kinds of things that are leading into this, but the Black Plague really just kind of puts a nail in that one. All right. So to wrap this conversation up here, real quick, let's talk about the end, quote unquote, of the plague. Now, the reason I have the end in quotes is because if you guys remember me saying it, the bubonic plague itself, like the actual disease, is still around today. It still exists even now. But the time period that we're talking about, the Black Death period, is obviously going to come to an end. And as we said, eventually this is going to lead into things like the Renaissance. Okay, it's going to be a while, of course. The Renaissance doesn't really get kicking off here for another 100 years or better. But really, it's the mentality and the mindset that comes from this that's going to just lead into the Renaissance and kind of that better vibe, better attitude, successes that are going to come along the way. All right, but to get to this, why does it end? Well, the one thing I can tell you that does not happen is they do not come up with a solution or necessarily a medicine or vaccine that knocks it out. That was not the case. But if you notice, there's a few things here that are very familiar, especially in these days, that became kind of the fix. So it ended because of things like quarantine. So obviously they got smarter to this, and as people came down with the Black Plague and they got sick, they themselves would not go walking around or get in a big group with a bunch of people. And also, those people who weren't sick but knew that somebody was, they would obviously stay away and quarantine themselves. So that seems pretty relevant these days, where even if you haven't directly had a disease like COVID, you might have been a contact of somebody, and that might have forced you or your family or somebody in your family to quarantine. So it's just kind of a safe step, even if you feel like you don't have it, to kind of distance yourself from people that possibly do. So that's something they did for the Black Plague. Goes along with this term of isolation. Of course, some groups themselves just decided when this thing broke out that they were going to isolate. So, for example, a lot of groups of people and a lot of families, instead of moving from the farms and the forests to the cities and the towns, they moved backwards. So they actually moved out of the towns and into the forest, or out of the big cities and into, the surrounding farm areas, because there were less people and there was way more space. So that sounds familiar as well. Hygiene, we've already talked about, as we mentioned. Just general cleanliness is going to improve. And they mentioned in the Brain Pop video as well, washing of hands, taking more baths or showers, and even getting rid of your like food waste and your, like restroom waste, for lack of a better term, right? People weren't really aware of how that was going to work. And they're just, kind of putting it outside their homes or wherever. They realized that they had to have better systems of getting rid of that type of stuff and or keeping themselves clean. So hygiene overall improved. And of course, as we know today, the more hand sanitizer you use, the more Clorox wipe you use, obviously you're going to have more clean surfaces and cleaner hands. So it decreases the ability for disease to spread. And last but not least, not the prettiest of terms, but cremation. Okay, for those that don't know what cremation is, it pretty much is the burning of dead bodies. All right. And in this case, we realize that as the disease goes on, we really don't have the luxury of having a funeral or having our families all together to celebrate this person that passed away. We pretty much have to stay as far away from the body as we can, because it's obviously still has the ability to infect us. So, what they decided to do kind of during the course of this Black Death period is, at one point they're just going to start collecting the bodies and they're going to take them out of town and they're just going to burn them all together so that there's nothing left, right? And I know that's pretty gross and pretty morbid, but they realize that that is really, for a lot of cases, the only way to stop this thing in its tracks. Because, if you had a big old funeral and a bunch of people came to the funeral and the body is obviously still has the ability to infect folks, that's not going to be a good situation. So really, that was one of the final steps they came up with, was if a bunch of people die from this, we'll just take them out of town and we'll just burn the bodies all up so that there's no bacteria left for anybody to pick up or to end up, inhaling or touching or whatever. Okay. So again, that was kind of a drawn out conversation, but as I told you all, there's more to just what you see on the bullet points. There's kind of a backstory for all of these, more or less. So just make sure, even if you wrote this as a minimum, clearly we've had a conversation today about how this whole thing broke down specifically. So that really leads us to the end of this time period. Now, to be honest, there's not much more, obviously, for this video today, but you guys that are working in class definitely are going to see this kind of crossword activity play itself out. And you guys that are working online, same story. So I'm going to post that Middle Ages crossword just the same. But we're going to be coming to the end of this unit very soon. and we're going to do some different things to kind of wrap it up. And for those that were working in class this week, I did mention that we're going to try to do something hopefully a little different because so many people have been out as far as a review, and if we're going to do a test or a quiz or something to that effect. But either way, you all that are working in class on this, obviously the word search, or sorry, the crossword is its own deal. And those working at home, you're going to see this posted with the announcement anyway, so it's going to be on the same document. All right. So for this, again, hopefully all the information that you guys see is now transposed into your notebook. And those working at home that maybe forgot their notebook, make sure you're putting it somewhere. I don't even care if you guys put it on, filler paper and then bringing it back to school when you come back. That's fine. But this is pretty vital information for the end of the Black Plague. All right. So again, hope everybody's doing well out there. Hope everybody's staying safe. And obviously, I will talk to you all very soon. All right. See ya.